Hello out there, myth and history lovers. This is Mr. P of Mr. P's Mythopedia here, and I have a smashingly good tale to tell you whenever or wherever you might be listening in at from this very moment. And of course, it has a little bit of a backstory to it. Let me begin by saying if there's one thing that we modern day 21st century folks love, it's a ghost story, complete with as grisly, bloody, and tragic a backstory as possible attached to it. We will go to great lengths to terrify ourselves. We go out to the movies to scare ourselves silly. We take in show after show of paranormal weirdness and read up on all of the most famous and mysterious supernatural events the world has to offer. We seemingly can't get enough, even if it keeps us up into the wee hours of the morning. Well, I'm here to tell you now that this whole fascination with ghosts and things that freak us out in the dark is definitely not a new phenomenon. That definitely goes back to a time probably almost as long as there have been human beings around on the planet. So think of your hunter and gatherers in a deep, dark forest late at night, huddled around a fire on a cold evening for warmth and protection, maybe cooking some food. Yeah, well, those hunter-gatherers had something they needed to do, so they would gather around and tell stories as scary and gruesome as possible. Why? One, because it's entertaining. Two, because it was fun to one each other up. The folks we're going to talk about tonight, the Greeks and the Romans, they were pretty into things that they couldn't necessarily explain either. Spirits, ghosts, nature spirits called daemons, which are not the same thing we think of when we hear of the modern word demon, more like nature spirits that were out in the wild taking care of business. And of course there were always the kings and queens of the big unexplainable, that would be the gods. So the Greeks and Romans were pretty tight on believing in all of those things and took them as a very real part of their world, far more than we even do today. The Romans even had a special type of spirit that they turned to and even invited into their very own homes called lares, which were loosely known as household gods, spirits of famous ancestors whose job it was to protect the family and home and give them guidance. The lares were so important that every house even had a small shrine to their particular lares, called the lararium, where small statues of their lares were given fruit and food and little trinkets of thanks by the family for continued help and protection. So you might say that ghosts were an everyday thing for the average Roman. If you were to ask a Roman about ghosts, they would definitely shake their head and say, yes, definitely they exist. Which leads us into our story here today, a rather interesting first-hand account of a ghostly encounter passed on by a famous Roman historian, a guy by the name of Pliny the Younger, who wrote the tale down as it was told to him, supposedly, by another man, a Greek living in Athens, appropriately named Athenodorus. We're not really sure when this little tale was put down into writing, but it was somewhere between 61 and 115 AD, in Pliny's adult life. The story, as it goes, sounds a little bit like this. To this story, let me add another as remarkable as the former, but attended with circumstances of greater horror, which I will give you exactly as it was related to me. There was at Athens a large and spacious, but ill-reputed and pestilential house. In the dead of the night, a noise, resembling the clashing of iron, was frequently heard, which, if you listened more attentively, sounded like the rattling of fetters. At first it seemed a distance, but approached nearer by degrees. Immediately afterward a phantom appeared in the form of an old man, extremely meager and squalor, with a long beard and bristling hair, rattling the gyves on his feet and hand. The poor inhabitants consequently passed sleepless nights under the most dismal terrors imaginable. This, as it broke their rest, threw them into distempers, which, as their horrors of mind increased, proved in the end fatal to their lives. For even in the daytime, though the spectre did not appear, yet the remembrance of it made such a strong impression on their imaginations that it still seemed before their eyes, and the terror remained when the cause of it was gone. By this means the house was at last deserted, as being judged by everybody to be absolutely uninhabitable, so that it was now entirely abandoned to the ghost. However, in hopes that some tenant might be found who was ignorant of this great calamity which attended it, a bill was put up, giving notice that it was either to be let or be sold. It happened that Athenodorus, the philosopher, came to Athens at this time, and reading the bill ascertained the price. The extraordinary cheapness raised his suspicion. Nevertheless, when he heard the whole story, he was so far from being discouraged, and he was more strongly inclined to hire it, and in short, actually did so. When it grew towards evening, he ordered a couch to be prepared for him in the fore part of the house, and after calling for a light, together with his pen and tablets, he directed all his people to retire within. But that his mind might not, for want of employment, be open to the vain terrors of imaginary noises and apparitions, he applied himself to writing with all his faculties. The first part of the night passed with usual silence. Then began the clanking of iron fetters. However, he neither lifted up his eyes nor laid down his pen, but closed his ears by concentrating his attention. The noise increased and advanced nearer, till it seemed at the door, and at last in the chamber. He looked round and saw the apparition exactly as it had been described to him. It stood before him, beckoning with its finger. Athenodorus made a sign with his hand that it should wait a little, and bent again to his writing. But the ghost rattling its chains over his head as he wrote, he looked round and saw it beckoning as before. Upon this he immediately took up his lamp and followed it. The ghost slowly stalked along, as if encumbered with its chains, and having turned into the courtyard of the house, suddenly vanished. Athenodorus, being thus deserted, marked the spot with a handful of grass and leaves. The next day he went to the magistrates, and advised them to order that spot to be dug up. There they found bones, commingled and intertwined with chains, for the body had mouldered away by long lying in the ground, leaving them bare and corroded by the fetters. The bones were collected and buried at the public expense, and after the ghost was thus duly laid, the house was haunted no more. And so there you have it. Despite the fact that the Romans were kicking around, running their empire, and doing their civilizing duties over 2,000 years ago, that does not change the fact that they too loved a good ghost story. Sure, it might lack the pizzazz, special effects, and or the descriptive language we might be used to today, but it shows that the Romans and Greeks were just as big of fans of creepy tales as we are now. The fact that it's still around after all this time for us to talk about proves that beyond a doubt. Was it all true? That's hard to say. Could Pliny have made it all up to impress a few friends at a party? Sure he could have. Could he have heard it secondhand and just thought it was interesting enough to write down? Absolutely. Did it actually happen as it was told? There's no way to know. But that doesn't really matter, as we all know when it comes to a good supernatural telling. It's the story that matters. And even though it's 2,000 years old, it's a pretty good story. All that being said, I hope you enjoyed the tale for what it was, and now realize that it's just another of the million ways possible that the Romans and Greeks were just like us, creeping each other out and begging for more. If you're an educator listening to this, feel free to use the link in the description below, which leads to the PDF version of this tale. Download it or print it out, and hand it off to your students to enjoy. And if you really dig mythology, legends, or other supernatural weirdness, feel free to subscribe to this channel for more. Or come visit my other project, Mr. P's Mythopedia, at the links provided in the video description. Thanks, and we'll see you again real soon for yet another spoken tale of ancient awesomeness.